Well, we have an update to the indirect nuclear deal talks between Iran and the United States. Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi says the U.S. must, quote, prove its will to lift major sanctions, and that, quote, guarantees are necessary for negotiations.
The United States left the 2015 nuclear deal in 2018 under the leadership of former President Trump, who also reimposed extensive sanctions on the country. Joining us now to discuss is Dr. Trita Parsi, author, professor at Georgetown University, and executive vice president at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Welcome, Trita.
Thank you.
And so, yeah, what is the latest?
The latest is that they're very, very close. Estimation of 95% of the issues have been resolved, but the remaining 5 are some of the toughest ones, including a demand by the Iranians for assurances or some mechanisms that would make it more difficult for the United States to exit the deal again, as well as some of the sanctions that I think from the Iranian side are very important to be lifted. Whereas for the U.S. side, that will probably be politically difficult because there will be a lot of criticism against the Biden administration if those sanctions are lifted. Those would be designations on key individuals in Iran as well as people in the IRGC. But they've come so far, it seems quite difficult to imagine that they would get all of this way, all 95% done, and then allow it to fall on the 5 last percent. So I do suspect that there is a decent likelihood that the deal would be struck within the next week or two. The question is what happens afterwards. And that's where I think the big difference will be between this JCPOA and the previous one.
Well, I think those assurances that it'll be harder for us to leave are going to be absolutely critical, rationally critical from Iran, because we left, last time. And,
it's not hypothetical.
And there is a very, very real chance that a Republican, or in fact Donald Trump again, becomes president in just a few years. So what would stop us from leaving again? So it's totally rational for that to be a sticking point.
It certainly is. And in fact, as a sign of the justification for the Iranians demanding this is actually exactly what the U.S. demanded in 2015. The United States did not want to strike a deal with the Rouhani government. They wanted to strike a deal with Iran, the country. In fact, the original American intent for the deal was for it to last 40 to 50 years, clearly seeking it to be a long-term deal that needed to be upheld by all consecutive Iranian administrations. So what did the U.S. do? The U.S. ensured that a new mechanism was put into the UN Security Council resolution called the snapback sanctions. Usually when you try to impose sanctions on a country, it can take months, if not years, because you have to build a consensus. It's not an easy process. The U.S. side argued that if the U.S. is going to have to do that, go through that entire process again, then that will not be a sufficient deterrent against Iranian cheating on an exit from a deal. It needs to be very swift. So snapback was a completely new mechanism in which essentially Russia and China gave up their veto. The United States alone can snap back all of the old UN sanctions on Iran in 30 days. And this was explicitly done as an assurance that the Iranians would not cheat. No such mechanism was put into the original deal to ensure that the United States would not cheat or exit the deal. Now, in the absence of any mechanisms that the U.S. is willing to agree to or that is politically feasible, it seems like what the Iranians have done is that they are negotiating to make sure that they can keep many of the new advanced centrifuges that they have built in the last 2 to 3 years. The calculation being that the best assurance to make sure that the United States doesn't leave the deal again is for the United States to know that Iran has very advanced centrifuges. And this time around, if the United States leaves, Iran can rebuild its program and get to the point that it is today with only 2-week breakout time very, very quickly, rather than it taking 3 years as it did last time. This ultimately, I think, is not a good thing. It would be much, much better if we were in the old situation in which, if there ever was any effort by the Iranians to cheat, it would be a long way for them to get to this point. But in the absence of any other mechanisms that we're putting in place, that is likely going to end up being the situation we have to deal with.
So, Trita, one of the biggest hurdles to the Iranian nuclear deal is, of course, Israel. So where are they on all of this? How are they blocking this at all? Are they supportive of it?
They're not supportive of it, although it is a different situation compared to what existed when Netanyahu was in power. He completely controlled this file, and even the dissent that existed within the Israeli government was completely silenced. And Israel spoke very clearly with one voice on this issue, and that was the voice of Netanyahu. Today, you have a different situation. There are cabinet members in the Bennett government who believe that the JCPOA, a renewal of it, is the least bad option from the Israeli perspective. And as a result, it's better for it to be renewed than to go through what we went through during the Trump era, in which Iran had no restriction on its nuclear program. But they're not the leading voice on this. Bennett still is the leading voice. But I think a big difference in how he's handling it is that he is opposing the JCPOA. He is challenging the JCPOA. I think, to a certain extent, he's also trying to undermine the negotiations, but he's not trying to undermine Biden. That's a big difference with Netanyahu, who took the fight to the U.S. Congress, challenged Obama directly, and also kind of saw an extra benefit of challenging the American president head on. That's not what Bennett is doing. He wants to make sure that he repairs relations with the United States and the Democratic Party in particular. So instead, he's challenging the JCPOA in Vienna itself. The Israelis have sent a delegation there, trying to convince the parties to take on unrealistically harsh positions and hawkish positions. That's one way of undermining it. There's a lot of leaks coming out on what's happening in the negotiations that are coming directly from the Israelis themselves. That appears to be an effort to undermine the negotiations as well. So I think the Bennett government, or Bennett himself, is still trying to be a problem, but he's trying to be a problem without directly challenging Joe Biden.
How involved are they in the talks? Like, do they have representatives who are kind of nearby? Like, where are they getting the information? Is the U.S. kind of negotiating alongside of them? How do they have so much access to information to be able to leak it to then undermine it?
So they are not part of the talks, obviously, but they have sent a delegation to Vienna, and they're talking to the other parties in the negotiations. I assume both European states and the United States itself is probably sharing some information with the Israelis, which they have then decided to leak in a way that I suspect is aimed at undermining the talks. This also happened during the Obama administration, incidentally. Obama was extremely generous early on in sharing intelligence on what was going on in the negotiations. Then U.S. intelligence picked up that the Israelis were selectively leaking information in order to undermine the talks. And as a result, the United States actually stopped sharing much of that information. I think the Biden administration has deliberately pursued a strategy of being very open with the Israelis in the hope that they wouldn't challenge or undermine the talks. And they are probably pleased that that Bennett is not challenging Biden directly, but I'm not so sure if they're pleased with some of these other leaks taking place.
With friends like these.
This time, they totally won't leak it this time.
Yeah, right. When it comes to one of the arguments that Iran has used to justify their nuclear program at all has been for energy purposes. So if they are going to be striking this deal with the United States, where are they going to be getting their energy?
Well, they are consuming most of the oil that they produce themselves internally right now. And it's been one of the big plans for the Iranians for a very long time, including during the time of the Shah, to build nuclear power so that they could use the oil and the gas that they're producing by exporting it rather than consuming as much of it internally. So the nuclear deal will not stop or impact Iran's ability to produce nuclear power. That the Iranians have been doing throughout this period. But it will prevent them from being able to engage in activities that can end up being useful for military purposes. But one thing on energy that might be worth mentioning right now, I'm sure you all have noticed that gas prices are pretty high. And the Biden administration has gone to the Saudis and asked them to produce more oil in order to push down gas prices as not only because of what's happening will happen in the elections this year in Congress, but also because of the way that it drives inflation. The Saudis have said no. If the JCPOA is struck, and if the Iranian oil comes back onto the market, which I suspect it will rather quickly if the deal is struck, then we're talking about 1.3 million barrels getting back onto the market on a daily basis. that will definitely have an impact on oil prices. That may, of course, be offset with what's happening between Russia and Ukraine, but it says something about the U.S. being so reliant on Saudi Arabia and some of the benefits of striking the JCPOA beyond the non-proliferation issue, which is that it would actually reduce America's dependency on Saudi Arabia.
Interesting.
Well, Trita Parsi, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Tomorrow on Rising, reporter Terrell Germain-Starr will join us for an update on Ukraine while on the ground in Kyiv.
And Pennsylvania House candidate Jonathan Lovitz will join us to weigh in on an amendment to the so-called Don't Say Gay bill in Florida, which would require schools to out students within 6 weeks.
Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss a video. We'll see you guys tomorrow. Bye-bye.
See you then.